Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and we are back with more the executive branch and the White House. We'll be looking at the Secretaries of War today, and it'll be a bit of a long one, as you can see, 5 people to talk about. But yeah, anyway, before we get into this, I do want to go ahead and remind you I've got 2 ways to donate to the channel if you are so inclined. I have a Patreon account, which allows you to donate month to month or a monthly basis. I have a Coffee account, which can do much the same, but it can also do single one-time donations. I'll have the link to both in the description box below the video. As usual, if you are in financial straits, please do not donate. I'd rather you take care of what you need to take care of, rather than donating to me, especially with the morons in charge. If you can donate, you can afford to, and you want to, thank you. I do appreciate it. It is me, myself, and I that do the videos, all the filming, editing, posting, all this. So, yeah. I don't do commercials as a personal choice, and I'm not making money from the videos as of yet. That being said, let's go ahead and jump into this. I don't care. Windows popping the window up. Hey, you need to do this. No, shut up. I'm busy. Secretary of War, as it was known back then, despite what the stupid people have tried to rename it while in office today. We have William Eustis serving as the first Secretary of War, 1809 to 1813. John Armstrong Jr. replacing him from 1813 to 1814. We have James Monroe serving 1814 to 1815, bringing us into the second term. And William H. Crawford replacing him 1815 to 1816, and finally acting secretary George Graham, who would end out Madison's tenure and would also help bring in Monroe's. With that said, let's go ahead and jump into this here from the University of Virginia's Miller Center. William Eustis, serving from 1809 to 1812. He was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts on June the 10th, 1753, graduating from Harvard University, which I think was still Harvard College back then. Began his national service, serving in the Revolutionary War, relying on medical education to serve as a surgeon with the Continental Army. So yeah, he was serving during the war, and he was basically a surgeon or a doctor trying to help treat the soldiers who were fighting during the war. Which I can only imagine it was a horrible and bloody mess, because back then we didn't have a lot of the stuff we have now. A lot of your antibiotics and anesthesia. You essentially take a swig or two of whiskey and then bite down on this while I have to take off your leg below the knee. It was that kind of stuff. Following the war, he began his own medical practice, and for 2 more years, he was actually reinstated with the federal troops as a surgeon during Shays' Rebellion. And I believe Shays' Rebellion's when members of the Continental Army felt they should have been paid more or weren't even paid for their services, because the war itself ends in 81 and Shays' Rebellion 86 and 87. Former soldiers taking up arms, a bit of a clash there. He would enter politics in 1788 and earn a seat in the Massachusetts State House of Representatives, serving until 1794, so 6 years altogether. Gaining experience with the national legislature by serving twice for the state of Massachusetts in the U.S. House of Representatives, 1801 to 1805, 2 years, and then again 1820 to 1823, another 2 years later on, and would actually serve as chairman of the Committee on Military Affairs during his second time in the U.S. House. 4 years after his first time in Congress, he accepted an offer from President James Madison and became Secretary of War, holding the office from 1809 to 1812. In 1814, Madison would make him the U.S. Minister to the Netherlands, and he would remain overseas until 1818. He would then come back, serve his second stint in the U.S. House of Representatives, and then become governor of Massachusetts in 1823, but die while in office February the 6th, 1825. Quite a bit of impact as far as serving in government. 12th governor of Massachusetts, member for the U.S. House of Representatives for Massachusetts, serving 2 different times, minister or envoy to the Netherlands for 4 years, and U.S. Secretary of War for 4, serving educated at Harvard, serving in the war as a surgeon. Born June 10th, 1753, Cambridge, Massachusetts, and died February 6, 1825, in Boston, Massachusetts. Notable battles during his time as a surgeon in the war. During the Revolutionary War, he served at Lexington and Concord, Bunker Hill, and the Siege of Boston. He also took part in Shays' Rebellion as a soldier, and then he was Secretary of War during the War of 1812. Armed uprising in response to a debt crisis among the citizenry and in opposition to the state's government's increased efforts to collect taxes on both individuals and their trade. So I was wrong. It wasn't about the military payment. It was taxation, Massachusetts individuals and what they did as their businesses, where they worked and stuff. Which, remember, this is still before a strong centralized government would be formed under the Constitution. So I'm sure Shays' Rebellion played an important role in shaping the idea we need a central government so we can have one form of currency, because prior to the Constitution it was the state's form of currency. Massachusetts would have a different one as to Pennsylvania, who would have a different one as to Virginia, so on. So yeah, you can see how that gets a bit messy. A lot more of the stuff was decided by the states. They would decide when they would collect taxes, how they would do this, how they would do that. And yeah, it was decided we need a central government, though we feared executive power to begin with. Not to get too far off topic. William Eustis, medical doctor, politician, statesman from Massachusetts. Let's see, served as a moderate Democratic Republican in the U.S. Congress, but when he was chosen to be Secretary of War, he lost his position mainly to the fact for the inexperience at managing the army and a lack of preparedness. Because remember, he wasn't technically a frontline soldier. He was a surgeon. Yes, he had military experience, but he was a surgeon during the war. And with the War of 1812, we were getting our butts kicked. The failures during the early months of the war were laid on his shoulders, leading to his resignation. But Madison would pick him to be minister to the Netherlands, so he would still serve James Madison, serving as the minister for the Netherlands for 4 years. Coming back, he would serve a second term in the United States Congress and then get elected governor of Massachusetts, and would prove popular to the long-serving John Brooks. but Eustis would die as governor of Massachusetts. His Boston mansion, built in the 1750s by Royal Governor William Shirley, is known as the Shirley Eustis House and is a National Historic Landmark today. And yeah, it's by Royal Governor, 1750s. Remember, the U.S. was still a set of colonies to Britain at that point. So we're talking about a house built before the U.S. was the U.S. Born to Benjamin Eustis, a Boston doctor, and Elizabeth Hill Eustis, who was the second surviving. William Eustis would be the second surviving son of 12 children. He was educated at Boston Latin School before entering Harvard College, graduating from Harvard in 1772. Studied medicine under Dr. Joseph Warren, himself a well-known patriot political leader, serving in the battles of Lexington and Concord, Battle of Bunker Hill, and served with the Army during the New York and New Jersey campaign. It is in the Continental Army where he would meet and established a strong friendship with New Jersey native and future Vice President Aaron Burr. Eustis will be placed in command of a military hospital established at the Loyalist Beverly Robinson, north of New York City, where he remained for the duration of the war. So, like I said, he didn't necessarily fight in the front lines. He was more taking care of the wounded and everything. He had training, experience, but not so much in the fighting. In September 1780, he played a minor role in the events surrounding the flight of traitor Benedict Arnold, treating Arnold's wife, Peggy, who was seemingly hysterical over the sudden departure of her husband and discovery of his plot. So yeah, remember, Benedict Arnold, much like the current traitor in office, betrayed our nation. After the war, he would return to medical practice in Boston, but would again be called in to serve in the military during Shays' Rebellion, which we just talked about, where taxes were trying to be placed, and some people were like, no. He would be elected to the Massachusetts state legislature from 88 to 94, serving 6 years, but left because he was sick of political gamesmanship of the Massachusetts state legislature. He was chosen to serve on the governor's council for 2 years, and in 1800 he ran for a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. And he would serve 2 terms. During his successful campaign against Josiah Quincy, Eustis was charged with either authoring or being complicit in the production of letters that formed a part of the 1783 Newburgh Conspiracy, a threatened uprising in the Continental Army. Eustis publicly denied being the author of the letters, but was silent on his role in the affair. John Armstrong later admitted to writing the letters, and Eustis acknowledged some years later that he was privy to the plot. So he didn't write them, but he knew of them. He was a moderate Democratic Republican, didn't seek significant reforms that the radical Republicans wanted. He voted against President Jefferson's repeal of the Judiciary Act of 1801, passed by John Adams' administration, and greatly expanded the number of seats on the federal bench. He was also one of 6 Democratic Republicans in the House to oppose the 12th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, provides for the procedure of electing the president and vice president. Because remember, we got in trouble under Jefferson. We had issues because prior to Madison, it was you voted for president, for vice president. Now, vice presidents were usually set up as a running mate or picked by the candidate themselves who's running for president. Because, yeah, there was so much of a problem, especially during the Adams and Jefferson elections. Washington was pretty unanimous, but Jefferson and Adams, there was a lot of problems because a lot of the vice presidents and presidents, a lot of their elections were so close. And then, of course, we're aware of Jefferson and Burr and all that went down there. So, yeah. In 1802, Eustis would be reelected his second term in the first round of the U.S. Congress, defeating future President John Quincy Adams in a rematch of the 1800 election with Quincy. He defeated him by less than 100 votes. So, yeah, Eustis, he was representing that district in Massachusetts, but apparently him not being very willing to have reform wasn't making him all that popular. While in the House, he was one of the impeachment managers appointed by the House of Representatives in 1804 to conduct impeachment proceedings, the first such impeachment proceedings to succeed against John Pickering, judge of the U.S. District Court for New Hampshire. He argued in favor of arming merchant vessels headed for the West Indies. Would serve as Secretary of War under Madison, the first one. Eustis was not a good choice for the post, lacking the necessary administrative skills and detailed military background. Like I said, yes, he had been trained. He was in technically the war, but mostly it was in his setup as a surgeon, a doctor. So, yeah. Senior commanders he would have difficult relationships with James Wilkinson and Wade Hampton. Eustis made a major push to update the military's field manuals, which had not been changed since the Revolutionary War, requiring after getting copies of the manuals published in 1791 for use in the armies of the French Republic, Eustis commissioned a translation and lobbied for adoption of the new manuals based on French tactics. Although a new manual was ready for use in 1812, it was not well received by the officer corps and was not used in the war that broke out that year. Tensions grew between the U.S. and Britain. Eustis made modest moves to improve military readiness, but did not otherwise distinguish himself or introduce other initiatives or proposals. And when the war began, the Army's logistics were in shambles, and it had no overall commander, forcing Eustis to make detailed decisions for 9 military districts. When the war began poorly with the surrender of General William Hull in Detroit, Eustis was severely criticized. Treasury Secretary Albert Gallatin wrote that there was a total want of confidence in Eustis that was felt through the ramification of the public service. Eustis would tender his resignation December 1812, and Secretary James Monroe would temporarily take over the duties until John Armstrong Jr. would assume the office February 13th, 1813. He would then be appointed minister to the Netherlands. See, Eustis unsuccessfully pursued claims against the Dutch for seizures of American goods and ships had taken place during the reign of Louis Bonaparte of the Kingdom of Holland. The claims were eventually acknowledged by France. A lot of the War of 1812 was American ships being seized, sailors being impressed into the military by Britain. Yeah, there was a lot of crazy stuff in the early days of the U.S. that was born out of the wars with Napoleon in France, between France and the rest of Europe. Upon his return to Europe, he purchased a mansion in Roxbury built by William Shirley. We mentioned the Shirley Eustace House. He would again be elected to the U.S. Congress in a special election after the resignation of Edward Dowse, and served from 1820 to 1823, 2 terms, presiding as chairman of the U.S. House Committee on Military Affairs. In the debate on the admission of Missouri as a state, leading to the Missouri Compromise, Eustace made an impassioned speech in opposition to the proposed language in the Missouri Constitution forbidding the entry of free blacks into the state. So Eustace was like, look, they're free blacks. They're regular citizens as far as others should be concerned. But Missouri's like, look, we're going to be a state and we don't want free blacks in the state. We are a slave state. Because remember, the Missouri Compromise kind of broke the idea that above a certain line, states would be free, while below a certain line, they were slave states. Missouri kind of shook that up because it went above that line of latitude. Anyway, I can't get in latitude longitude mixed up. He would then serve as a governor of Massachusetts, run for unsuccessfully for governor of Massachusetts, losing each time to popular moderate Federalist John Brooks. But in 1823, he won the seat in a highly contentious contest with the popular arch-Federalist Harrison Gray Otis. Eustace was presented as a moderate successor to Brooks, who would be less partisan than Otis, and also highlighted his Revolutionary War experience. He carried Federalist strongholds in Hampshire and Essex County, and very nearly defeated Otis in Boston. His victory in the election, combined with the Republican sweep of the legislature the following year, marked an effective end of the Federalist Party in Massachusetts. On the national stage, the only Federalist president was John Adams. But they were still like members in Congress, still members on state levels. But once Eustace was finally elected governor, it was effectively, we saw an end to the Federalist Party in the state of Massachusetts. He was a popular governor, continuing Brooks' moderate policies, and had nominated the lieutenant governor, Levi Lincoln Jr., to the state's high court. And Eustace would win re-election in 1824 with former Representative Marcus Morton as his lieutenant governor. He received old friend Lafayette, I'm assuming the Lafayette who designed D.C., when he toured the U.S. In March through April of 1824, perhaps due to his popularity, Eustace was honored with a single vote at the Democratic-Republican Party caucus to be the party's candidate for U.S. vice president at the election later that year. So, yeah, he was so popular as governor that he even got a vote to be the Democratic Republicans' vice president choice for whoever would be the president. Eustis died in Boston of pneumonia while governor on February 6, 1825. He and Burr would be good friends, exchanging letters on a number of different intimate subjects, recommending potential romantic partners to each other and sharing a taste for well-educated women. Just a couple of boys. It's like, damn, I love this woman. You need to check her out. She's highly intelligent, highly educated, and damn, does she look good. You can just see them kind of writing to each other like that. So, Eustace aided Burr on one occasion by helping him find accommodations for a young woman whose mother had been involved in an adulterous relationship with Alexander Hamilton. She was placed in a Boston area boarding school. Eustace may have also been the subject of a teenage crush by Burr's own daughter, Theodosia, who would share intimate details of her life with him including medical conditions emanating from a difficult pregnancy well into adulthood. Eustace, for himself, for many years was a confirmed bachelor, described as urbane and charming. So, fairly popular with the ladies. But he would marry Caroline Langdon in 1801, though they would have no children. She was the sister of Henry Langdon, who had married Eustace's sister Anne and was the daughter of Woodbury Langdon, a prominent Portsmouth, New Hampshire merchant and judge. His wife survived him by 40 years, after which his Boston property was divided among relatives. His mansion fell into decay but was acquired by preservationists in 1913 and restored to the 1800s grandeur in the late 1900s. So, yeah, it is now a house museum and national landmark. So that gives us a good look at William Eustace, the first Secretary of War. Now, let's go with his follow-up, John Armstrong Jr. First, let's go to the U.S. bio guide for Congress members, since Armstrong Jr. actually apparently served in Congress as well. He was the son of John Armstrong Sr. and brother of James Armstrong, and was a delegate from Pennsylvania and a senator from New York. Born in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, November the 25th, 1758, and attended Princeton College, now Princeton University, but left the college to enter the Revolutionary Army, serving in the Revolutionary War, Secretary of State for Pennsylvania, 1783 to 1787, Adjutant General for several years, delegate to the Confederation Congress, 1787 to 1788. Remember, Articles of Confederation was what we were using as our government's document of choice. We didn't have yet the Constitution, so the Congress was the Confederation Congress. And so, yeah, he was serving in Congress before it was the Constitutional Congress. Moved to Dutchess County, New York in 1789 and settled near Lexington Manor, elected to the United States Senate to fill the vacancy in the term ending March 3rd, 1801, caused by the resignation of John Lawrence in 1801. He would be reelected in 1801 and served November the 6th, from November the 6th, 1800, till February the 5th, 1802, when he resigned and was next appointed to the Senate to fill the vacancy in the term ending March 3rd, 1807, caused by the resignation of successor DeWitt Clinton, and served from November the 10th, 1803 until February 23rd, 1804. Subsequently elected to fill the vacancy in the term ending March the 3rd, 1809, caused by the resignation of Theodorus Bailey, and served February 25th, 1804 until June 30th, 1804, when he again resigned to enter the diplomatic service. So he's a fallback to serve in the U.S. Congress multiple times when people themselves resigned, because it's like, hey, he's a good choice. He seems to make sense. He would serve as Minister of France from 1804 to 1810, and also acted as Minister to Spain in 1806. During the War of 1812, was commissioned Brigadier General, Secretary of War in the cabinet of President James Madison, 1813 to 1814. Engaged in literary pursuits, and died in Red Hook, New York on April 1st, 1843. So, yeah. Let's look at his Britannica entry here. Born November 25th, 1758 in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and died April 1st, 1843 in Red Hook, New York. He was an American soldier, diplomat, and politician who also was a U.S. Secretary of War during the War of 1812, and was blamed for the British capture of Washington, D.C. So his predecessor is blamed for failures early in the war, and then John Armstrong Jr. would get blamed for the capture of D.C., which we talked about the then White House being burned. He fought in the American Revolution, 1775 to 1783, and as an officer in the Continental Army was apparently the author of the Newburgh conspiracy addresses attacking Congress. Remember, they thought Eustis was responsible for it. Turns out, no, he didn't write them. He knew about them, but yeah. After the war, he entered politics in New York, serving briefly as U.S. Senator from 1804 to 1810, and from 1804 to 1810 was U.S. Minister to France. When the War of 1812 began, he served as Brigadier General, and from February 1813 to September 1814 as Secretary of War under James Madison, with whom he shared blame for the failure to provide men and equipment to protect Washington, D.C. from British troops who burned the Capitol on August the 24th, 1814. Unpopularity forced him to resign his cabinet position. Let's go ahead and look at his Wikipedia entry. U.S. Secretary of War, Minister to France, Senator from New York 3 times, Because, like we said, he kept getting put in there to serve for people who resigned. John Lawrence. And when he would leave, he would get replaced by DeWitt Clinton, and then DeWitt Clinton would leave, he would serve, and get replaced by John Smith after he resigned again. And then for the final time, he would be preceded by Theodorus Bailey, who resigned. And when he was finally resigned the third time, he was replaced by Samuel Mitchell, member of the Continental Congress for the state of Pennsylvania, educated at Princeton University, served in the Continental Army and then the U.S. Army, took part during the Revolutionary War at the Battle of Princeton, Battle of Saratoga, and was pretty much made responsible during the War of 1812 for the burning of Washington, which, as we've already mentioned, Dolly Madison running from the White House with the portrait of George Washington to escape, born to General John Armstrong Sr. and Rebecca Lyon Armstrong. John Sr. was a renowned Pennsylvania soldier, born of Irish and Scottish descent. John Jr.'s older brother, James Armstrong, would become a physician and U.S. congressman. After his early education in Carlisle, he studied at Princeton, nowadays Princeton University, but would break off his studies to return to Pennsylvania and fight in the Revolutionary War. He fought at the Battle of Princeton, Battle of Saratoga. While in camp with, I'm thinking Horatio. I kept wanting to say Horatio, but I'm like, is that not the British general? No, it's one of ours. He would become an aide to General Horatio Gates, and while in camp with Gates in Newburgh, New York, became involved in what is known as the Newburgh Conspiracy or Newburgh Addresses, and is generally acknowledged as the author of the two anonymous letters directed at the officers in the camp. The first, titled An Address to the Officers, called for a meeting to discuss back pay and other grievances with the Congress and form a plan of action, after General George Washington ordered the meeting canceled and called for a milder meeting on March the 15th. A second address appeared that claimed that this showed that Washington supported their actions, and Washington successfully diffused the protest without a mutiny. While some of Armstrong's later correspondents acknowledged his role, there was never any official action that connected him with the anonymous letters. Yeah, remember, Washington, during the war, as it kind of drug on, a lot of his popularity waned. And a lot of the soldiers and generals and stuff, some of them had strong disapproval because it's like, we're getting nowhere in this war. They're beating our hind end. What are we going to do? There had been some victories here and there for the Continental Army, but Britain had also made a lot of progress. So there wasn't really a lot of looked like daylight for a chance to win. So yeah. And then of course there was the infamous winter at Valley Forge, and Washington had to go through and hang some soldiers who were considered too mutinous to try to show, look, I am in charge. We are trying to survive and get things done. We are trying to win this. So yeah. Let's see. Armstrong was named an adjutant general of Pennsylvania's militia and served as Secretary of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania under the colony presidents Dickinson and Franklin. And in 1784, he led a military force of 400 militiamen into a controversy with Connecticut settlers in the Wyoming Valley of Pennsylvania. His tactics raged the nearby states of Vermont and Connecticut, which sent their own militia into the area. Yeah, it shows you. The early states were so autonomous that they would often be willing to form militias against each other. Timothy Pickering was dispatched to forge a solution to the difficulty, and the settlers were able to keep title to the land they had tamed. In 1787 and 1788, he was sent as a delegate to for Pennsylvania to the Congress of the Confederation, and the Congress offered to make him Chief Justice of the Northwest Territory. He declined this, as well as other public offices, for the next dozen years. He resumed public life after the resignation of U.S. Senator John Lawrence of New York and was elected to replace him and reelected, but resigned, and DeWitt Clinton took over for him. In 1804, February, he again was elected to the U.S. Senate to fill the vacancy caused by the resignation of Theodore Bailey, thus moving from, I don't know what, I guess that's his level in the military, Class 3 to Class 1 seat, but only 4 months before Jefferson would actually appoint him as a U.S. minister to France. So, as his time in France, he would be the author of the first major work of reference for the diplomatic corps, pioneering contribution to the emergence of doctrinal views and a specialist literature of international law. Served as minister in Paris until September 1810, and in 1806, briefly spent time representing the U.S. at the court of Spain. When the War of 1812 broke out, he was called to military service and was commissioned as a brigadier general and placed in charge of the defenses at the port of New York. Then in 1813, Madison would name him Secretary of War to replace Eustis. This he was barely confirmed by the Senate 18 to 15. Made a number of valuable changes to the armed forces, but was so convinced that the British would not attack D.C., he did nothing to defend the city when it became clear it was the objective of the even when it became clear it became the objective of the invasion force. After the American defeat at the Battle of Bladensburg and the subsequent burning of Washington, D.C., Madison, usually a forgiving man, forced him to resign in September 1814. Armstrong would return to his farm and resume a quiet life, published a number of histories, biographies, and some works on agriculture. He later died at La Bergerie, later renamed Rokeby, the farm estate he built in Red Hook, New York in 1843, and is buried in the cemetery in Rhinebeck. Personal life: married Alida Livingston, the youngest child of Judge Robert Livingston and Margaret Livingston. Alida was also the sister of Chancellor Robert R. Livingston and Edward Livingston. Together they had Armstrong and Alida had 7 children, named one named him Horatio Gates Armstrong as a tribute to his former general Horatio Gates. They also had Henry Beekman Armstrong, John Armstrong, Robert Livingston Armstrong, Margaret Rebecca Armstrong, James Kosciuszko Armstrong, I'm assuming, I'm not sure, and William Armstrong. Armstrong died, Red Hook, New York. That is a look at John Armstrong Jr., which will bring us to James Monroe. He briefly served before John Armstrong Jr., but would actually get appointed Secretary of War after Armstrong Jr. Was the fifth president of the U.S., 1817 to 1825, and the last president considered as part of the founding fathers, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe. On New Year's Day, 1825, the last of the annual White House receptions, President James Monroe made a pleasing impression on a Virginia lady who shook his hand. He is tall and well-formed, his dress plain and in the old style. His manner was quiet and dignified. From the frank, honest expression of his eye, I think he well deserves the encomium passed upon him by the great Jefferson, who said Monroe was so honest that if you turned his soul inside out, there would not be a spot on it. Wow, they thought a lot of this man. Born in Westmoreland County, Virginia in 1758, he attended the College of William and Mary, fought with distinction in the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War, and practiced law in Fredericksburg, Virginia. As a youthful politician, he joined the Anti-Federalists in the Virginia Convention, which ratified the Constitution, and in 1790, an advocate of Jeffersonian policies, was elected U.S. Senator. As Minister to France in 1794 to 1796, he displayed strong sympathies for the French cause. Later, with Robert R. Livingston, he helped negotiate the Louisiana Purchase. His ambition and energy, together with the backing of President Madison, made him the Republican choice for the presidency in 1816. With little Federalist opposition, he easily won re-election in 1820 and made unusually strong cabinet choices, including naming a Southerner, John C. Calhoun, as his Secretary of War, and a Northerner, John Quincy Adams, as Secretary of State. Only Henry Clay's refusal kept Monroe from adding an outstanding Westerner. Early in his administration, he undertook a goodwill tour. At Boston, he visited his visit was held as the beginning of the era of good feelings. Unfortunately, these good feelings would not endure, although Monroe, his popularity undiminished, followed nationalist policies. Across the facade of nationalism, ugly sectional cracks appeared. A painful economic depression undoubtedly increased the dismay of the people of the Louisiana Territory of 1819 when their application for admission to the Union as a slave state failed. An amended bill was gradually eliminating slavery in Missouri. An amended bill for gradually eliminating slavery in Missouri precipitated 2 years of bitter debate in Congress. The Missouri Compromise Bill resolved the struggle, pairing Missouri as a slave state with Maine, a free state, and barring slavery north and west of Missouri forever. Remember, Maine was just shaved off New Hampshire. They basically just said, we'll cut one of your territories up, or one of your current states up, and make two. That way you'll have another one as opposed to the slave state in Missouri, which was complete and utter horseshit. In foreign affairs, Monroe proclaimed the fundamental policy that bears his name, the Monroe Doctrine, responding to the threat that the more conservative governments in Europe might try to add Spain aid Spain in winning back her former Latin American colonies. Monroe did not begin formally to recognize the younger sister republics until 1822, after ascertaining that Congress would vote appropriations for diplomatic missions. He and Secretary of State John Quincy Adams wished to avoid trouble with Spain until he had ceded the Floridas, and was done in 1821. Let's see, Britain, with its powerful navy, who opposed reconquest of Latin America, and suggested that the U.S. join in proclaiming hands off. Ex-presidents Jefferson and Madison counseled Monroe to accept the offer, but Secretary Adams advised it would be more candid to avow our principles explicitly to Russia and France than come in as a cockboat in the wake of the British man of war. John Quincy Adams clearly had a dislike of Britain, who had just kicked our butts the presidency before under Madison. And I was like, look, better to go with Russia and France. Monroe accepted Adams' advice, and not only must Latin America be left alone, he warned, but also Russia must not encroach southward on the Pacific coast. The American continents, he stated, by the free and independent condition which they have assumed and maintain, are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European power. Some 20 years after Monroe died in 1831, it became known as the Monroe Doctrine. This is from whitehouse.gov. And let's hop over to Britannica. Monroe was born April 28, 1758, died July the 4th, 1831. The third of the 5 founding fathers to do so die on July the 4th. So, yeah, truly American Americans in New York City, New York. He was the 5th president of the U.S., issued an important contribution to U.S. foreign policy in the Monroe Doctrine, a warning to European nations against intervening in the Western Hemisphere. The period of his administration had been called the Era of Good Feelings. Born to Spencer Monroe, who was of Scottish descent, and Elizabeth Jones Monroe, who was of Welsh descent. So he was Scottish Welsh. The family were owners of a modest 600 acres or 240 hectares in Virginia. At the age of 16, he entered the College of William and Mary in 1776, but in 1776, he left to fight in the American Revolution, and at the rank of lieutenant, he crossed the Delaware with General George Washington for the Battle of Trenton, suffered a near-fatal wound in his shoulder, carried from the field, recovered, and was promoted to captain for heroism, took part in the battles of Brandywine and Germantown, became a major, and aide-de-camp to General William Alexander, Lord Stirling, and with him shared the suffering of the troops at Valley Forge in the cruel winter of 1777 to 78. Was a scout for George Washington at the Battle of Monmouth, and served as Lord Stirling, General Alexander's adjutant general. 1780, he resigned his commission in the army and began to study law under Thomas Jefferson, then governor of Virginia. And between the two men, there developed an intimacy and sympathy that had a powerful influence upon Monroe's later career. Jefferson also fostered a friendship between Monroe and James Madison. So those three men who were presidents in a row, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe, were all as well good friends. Monroe was elected to the Virginia House of Delegates in 1782 and was chosen as a member of the Governor's Council. From 1783 to 1786, he served in the Continental Congress under the Confederation Congress, I should say, under the Articles of Confederation, which, as we've noted before, the U.S. governing document before the Constitution. Served his term, he vigorously insisted on the right of the U.S. to navigate the Mississippi River, then controlled by the Spanish, and attempted in 1785 to secure for the weak Congress the power to regulate commerce, thereby removing one of the great defects in the existing central government under the Articles of Confederation. In 1786, Monroe, then 27 years of age, and Elizabeth Courtwright of New York, then 17 years of age, were married. They had two daughters, Eliza Courtwright and Maria Hester, and a son who died in infancy. Eliza often was at her father's side as official hostess and when he was president, and substituting for her ailing mother. Maria's marriage to a cousin, Samuel L. Governor, in 1820 was the first wedding performed in the president's house, as the White House was then called. Again, age of different ways of looking at relationships. 10 years of age, perfectly normal at that point. I know a lot of people of age now, the younger generations, are like, 10 years? Really? And it may be looked as more of a serious issue rather than, hey, that's pretty normal. Now, that was pretty normal back then. So, yeah. And then her being 17 years of age, marrying at that age, again, somewhat fairly normal. Most girls married 16, 17, 18. Remember, Monroe himself went into college at the age of 16. So it wasn't seen as 18 being adult. Usually 16 was, hey, you are now an adult. You can do what needs to be done. It's your turn to take care of yourself. So that's what was seen in that day and age. And then the marriage to the cousin thing, didn't say first cousin, it just said cousin. So it could have been more of a distant cousin. Still, I know a lot of people would get the icks by that, but I won't say it's common. It's not unusual. Retiring from Congress in 1786, he began practicing law at Fredericksburg, Virginia, and was chosen as a member of the Virginia House of Delegates, Virginia's legislature at the time, in 1787, and in 1788 became a member of the state convention at which Virginia ratified the new federal constitution. So he was part of Virginia's group that said, yeah, we want the Constitution over the Articles of Confederation. He was, in 1790, elected to the U.S. Senate, where he vigorously opposed President Washington's administration. Nevertheless, in 1794, Washington nominated him as minister to France. It was the hope of the administration that Monroe's well-known French sympathies would secure for him a favorable reception, and that his appointment would also conciliate France's friendship with the U.S. his warm welcome in France and his enthusiasm for the French Revolution, which he regarded as a natural successor to the American Revolution, displeased the Federalists, the party of Alexander Hamilton, which encouraged close ties not to France, but to England. Monroe did nothing, moreover, to reconcile the French to the Jay Treaty, which regulated commerce and navigation between the U.S. and Britain during the French Revolutionary Wars. Without real justification, the French regarded the treaty as a violation of the French-American Treaty of Commerce and Amity of 1778 and a possible cause for war. Monroe led the French government to believe that the Jay Treaty would never be ratified by the United States, that the administration of George Washington would be overthrown as a result of the obnoxious treaty, and that better things might be expected after the election in 1796 of a new president, perhaps Thomas Jefferson. Washington, though he did not know of this intrigue, sensed that Monroe was unable to represent his government properly, and in late 1796 recalled him. Monroe would return to America in the spring of 1797, and in the following December published a defense of his course in the pamphlet of 500 pages entitled A View of the Conduct of the Executive in the Foreign Affairs of the United States. Washington seems never to have forgiven Monroe for this stratagem, though Monroe's opinion of Washington and Jay underwent a change in later years. In 1799, Monroe was chosen governor of Virginia and was twice elected, serving until 1802. There was much uneasiness in the United States when Spain restored Louisiana to France by the Treaty of San Ildefonso in October 1800 and confirmed in March 1801. The Spanish district administers subsequent withdrawal of the U.S. right of deposit at New Orleans, the privilege of storing goods there for later shipment, greatly increased the feeling and led to much talk of war. Resolved to settle the matter by peaceful measures, Jefferson, in January 1803, appointed Monroe envoy extraordinary and minister plenipotentiary to France to aid Robert R. Livingston, the resident minister, in purchasing the territory at the mouth of the Mississippi, including the island of New Orleans, authorizing him at the same time to cooperate with Charles Pinckney, the minister of Madrid, in securing from Spain the secession of East and West Florida. On April 18th, Monroe was further commissioned as the regular minister to Great Britain. Monroe joined Livingston in Paris on April the 12th after the latter's negotiations were well underway, and the two ministers, on finding Napoleon willing to dispose of the entire province of Louisiana, decided to exceed their instructions and effect its purchase. Accordingly, on May the 2nd, 1803, they signed a treaty and two conventions antedated to April 30th, whereby France sold Louisiana to the United States, and the fact that Monroe signed the treaty along with Livingston did not hurt his political career at home, but he is not entitled to much credit for the diplomatic achievement. So yeah, Jefferson was president, but Monroe was there in person with Livingston to actually sign the agreement, negotiate and sign it. In July 1803, Monroe left Paris and entered upon his duties in London, and in the autumn of 1804, he proceeded to Madrid to assist Pinckney in his efforts to define the Louisiana boundaries and acquire the Floridas. After negotiating until May 1805 without success, he returned to London and resumed his negotiations concerning the impressment of American seamen and the seizure of American vessels. As the British ministry was reluctant to discuss the vexing questions, little progress was made, and in May of 1806, Jefferson ordered William Pinckney of Maryland to assist Monroe. The result of the deliberations was a treaty signed on December 31st, 1806, which contained no provision against impressments and provided no indemnity for the seizure of goods and vessels. So they got a treaty, but it didn't get anything they wanted in it. Accompanying, or at least the two big issues, accompanying its signature was a British reservation maintaining freedom of action to retaliate against imminent French maritime decrees. In passing these matters, Monroe and Pinckney had disregarded their instructions, and Jefferson was so displeased with the treaty that he returned it to England for revision. Monroe returned to the United States in December 1807 and was elected to the Virginia House of Delegates in the spring of 1810. It was in the following winter he was again chosen governor, serving from January to November of 1811, when he resigned to become Secretary of State under James Madison, a position he held until March 1817, and the direction of foreign wars in the troubled period immediately preceding and during the War of 1812 with Great Britain thus fell upon him. On September the 27th, 1814, after the capture of Washington, D.C. by the British, he was appointed Secretary of War and discharged the duties of his office in addition to those of the Department of State until March 1815. He would be elected President in 1816 of the United States as the Republican candidate, defeating Rufus King, the Federalist candidate, with 183 electoral votes to King's 34. Re-elected in 1820, receiving all electoral votes but one. The Federalists had ceased to function as a party. The chief events of his calm and prosperous administration, which had been called the Era of Good Feelings, were the First Seminole War, 1817 to 1818, the acquisition of the Floridas from Spain as president, 1819 to 1821, and the Missouri Compromise, a complete and utter failure, in 1820, by which the first conflict over slavery under the Constitution was peacefully settled, though it just more or less kicked the can down the road. Recognition of the new Latin American states, former Spanish colonies in Central and South America in 1822, and thus the Monroe Doctrine. Most intimately connected with Monroe, the enunciation in the presidential message of December the 2nd, 1823, which has profoundly influenced foreign policy in the United States. It was originally meant, hey, keep out of North and South and Central America and the Caribbean. You stay in Europe. You're in Europe. You got Europe, Africa, Asia, Australia. That's all yours. We deal with the Americas. You do not put any more colonies here. Not until 1848, when James K. Polk was president, did the first reference to Monroe's statement as a doctrine appear, and John Quincy Adams, as Secretary of State for Monroe, was seen as the one who really pushed for the recognition of the Monroe Doctrine. His wife and daughters still had a lot with French to do, dealing with their styles and etiquette and everything. But yeah, there's still a lot to read, but I ain't gonna read through them all. God damn, this is taking so long. James Monroe. That would lead us to the next choice, William Harris Crawford, who would be a senator from Georgia, born in Nelson County, Virginia, on February the 24th, 1772, moved with his father to Edgefield District, South Carolina in 1779, and to Columbia County, Georgia in 1783. So he spent some of his youth kind of moving around there. Virginia, South Carolina, Georgia. He pursued classical studies in the private school and Richmond Academy in Augusta, Georgia, studied law, admitted to the bar, and commenced practice in Lexington, Georgia in 1799. Appointed to prepare a digest of laws of Georgia in 1799. Member of the Georgia State House of Representatives 1803 to 1807. Elected to the U.S. Senate to fill the vacancy caused by the death of Abraham Baldwin, and served from November the 7th, 1807 to March the 23rd, 1813, when he resigned, he would serve as President pro tempore of the Senate during the 12th Congress, declined appointment as Secretary of War under President Madison in 1813 to replace Eustis, was named Minister to France 1813 to 1815, returned home to act as an agent for the sale of the land donated by Congress to Lafayette, but then appointed Secretary of War by President Madison in August of 1815, but transferred to the Treasury in October 1816 and served under Madison and Monroe until 1825. Unsuccessful Democratic Republican candidate for president in the U.S. in 1824. Due to illness, refused to tender of President John Quincy Adams that he remain Secretary of the Treasury, returned to Georgia and appointed judge of the Northern Circuit Court in 1827, which he held until his death in Oglethorpe County, Georgia on September the 15th, 1834. It's according to his bio guide entry. Let's see how long this Britannica entry is. I don't want another giant one like Monroe's tried to be. Okay, it ain't too long. Born February 24, 1772 in Amherst County, now Nelson County, Virginia. Died September 15th, 1834 in Elberton, Georgia. Was an American political leader in the early U.S. Republic. Finished third in the electoral votes in the four-candidate race for president in 1824. After living in Virginia and South Carolina, his family moved to Georgia, where William attended Moses Waddell's Carmel Academy and then taught school in Augusta, studied law, and in 1799 opened a law practice in Lexington, Georgia. As a Jeffersonian Republican, he entered elective politics in 1803, winning a seat in the Georgia legislature, and in 1807 he went to Washington to fill the unexpired term of Georgia's deceased U.S. Senator Abraham Baldwin. In the Senate, he quickly earned a reputation for wisdom and sound judgment, and the Georgia legislature elected him to a full term as senator in 1811. Crawford backed U.S. preparations for the declaration of war against Britain in 1812, unlike most Democratic Republicans, and favored a tariff and extension of the charter of the Bank of the United States. When Vice President George Clinton died in 1812, Crawford was elected President pro tempore of the Senate, which his predecessor Baldwin had been, but left the position the following year to become Minister of France. In 1815, President James Madison appointed Crawford Secretary of War, and a year later named him Secretary of the Treasury, a position in which from 1816 to 1825 Crawford's abilities were best utilized. A leading candidate for the presidential nomination in 1816, Crawford deferred to James Monroe and was elected and who retained Crawford as Secretary of the Treasury. Monroe was re-elected virtually without opposition in 1820, and in 1824 was again a presidential prospect along with John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, and Andrew Jackson. The election of the corrupt bargain. Crawford won the vote of the party caucus, but in 1824 the caucus system had fallen into disrepute, and its choice was meaningless. At the time of the election, Crawford was paralyzed and nearly blind as a result of a stroke. Although his supporters claimed he was steadily improving, he finished a distant third behind Adams and Jackson. Crawford refused Adams' invitation to stay on as Secretary of Treasury and instead returned to Georgia, where he served as a judge until his death. So, Georgia State Superior Court Judge, U.S. Secretaries of the Treasury, U.S. Secretary of War, U.S. Minister to France, President pro tempore in the U.S. Senate, where he was a senator from Georgia, and also served as a member of the Georgia House of Representatives. Was married to a Susanna Gerardine, having 7 children. So William H. Crawford. Finally, in this giant freaking video, let's look at the acting Secretary of War, George Graham. Born in Dumfries, Virginia in 1772 and graduated from Columbia University, he began his professional career in the early 1790s practicing law in his hometown. He entered public service several years later and as a delegate from Fairfax County to the General Assembly of Virginia, serving with that body for multiple terms. Upon the outbreak of war with Great Britain in 1812, Graham joined the American military and recruited the Fairfax Light Horse Cavalry Division, which he commanded from 1812 to 1814. Graham would leave the Army in 1814 to take an assignment in the War Department, where he worked for 2 years as chief clerk by appointment of the Secretary of War, James Monroe, 1814 to 1816. It was also part of the commission that met with the British in 1815 to conclude an appropriate settlement following the war. In 1816, Graham ascended to the post of Secretary of State, serving on an interim basis until 1817, while newly elected President James Monroe looked for a more permanent candidate. After exploring a portion of eastern Texas as a special agent to the War Department in 1818, he returned to the nation's capital and became president of the Washington branch of the Bank of the United States from 1819 to 1823, and left the bank in 1823 to serve as a commissioner of the General Land Office in the U.S. He died in office in 1830. So, yeah. So, commissioner of the General Land Office of the U.S. under Monroe, Quincy Adams, and Jackson. Secretary of War under Madison and Monroe. Member of the Fairfax Virginia House of Delegates from the Fairfax County District. So state legislature, the Virginia House of Delegates, educated at Columbia University, and actually buried at Arlington National Cemetery. So he's one of the individuals buried there. But yeah, captain of a unit called the Fairfax Light Horse Cavalry, part of the Virginia militia in the War of 1812. Born to Jane Brent and merchant husband Richard Graham in Dumfries, Virginia, having 2 brothers and a sister. He was of high rank, but not part of the first families of Virginia. He married twice in 1803, marrying widow Mary Ann Barnes, who, 1768 to 1814, who was the daughter of a prominent local lawyer and landowner, Gerald Who, and then widow, who had 6 children, George Mason V, who was a eldest brother of one of his classmates. And she died in 1796. Mary Ann Barnes, who had bore 4 children as well before her death in 1814 from complications of the final childbirth. So yeah. And of course, some of the children would die as infants, though they would have a son, George Mason Graham, who would become a lawyer, planner, and office holder in Louisiana, and a daughter, Mary, who would become a Catholic nun in D.C. So yeah, let's see, she had actually willed that 3 slaves she had, Richard Barnes Mason, willed 3 slaves to Richard Barnes Mason and 2 to George Mason Graham, and several of their children to Mary and Jane Graham, although a codicil changed the 2 named African Americans, Negroes, as they're also called here, given to George Mason Graham to her daughter Sally B. Mason instead. In 1825, okay, so his first wife was Mary Ann Barnes. His second was Jane Love Watson, 1799 to 1869, when she lived, whose brother would be James M. Watson, a Commodore in the U.S. Navy, and they would have at least 3 children, with their son to survive to adulthood, serving in the U.S. Marine Corps during the Mexican War and the American Civil War, and afterward commanded the Mare Island Naval Shipyard. And their daughter, Jenny Brent Graham, married Georgia-born career naval officer Henry Collett Davenport, who would actually remain loyal to the Union during the American Civil War. Richard Graham Davenport would also be buried in Arlington. So yeah. But yeah. And that's look at the final entry here. Oh, that was a long one. Over an hour and a half in length. But with that long ass entry, we'll go ahead and end this episode there. My butt is hurting from sitting on it so long. As always, educate thyself. Think, read, study, learn. Someone tells you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources, and it can't be tinfoil hat wearing sources or anecdotes thrown together to try to make sources. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, later.